Hi, I'm Rebecca Turkington with the Institute for Women, Peace and Security at Georgetown University. It is a pleasure and privilege to be here today with the Honorable Mary Robinson, who probably needs no introduction, former President of Ireland, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She is currently serving as the UN Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region, as well as President of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, and serving as one of the global elders. We're so honored today that she's taken some of her time during her trip to speak with us about her experiences in the DRC and generally with Women, Peace and Security agenda. Thank you so much and welcome to Georgetown.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start today with asking you a little bit about your work in the Great Lakes region, which you'll be speaking about later this morning. The DRC conflict so often becomes synonymous with sexual and gender-based violence, and we very rarely hear the stories of women who are working as agents for peace in the process. Could you talk a little bit about the roles that women are playing in peace building and the ways that you are engaging women and women's organizations in the peace process, particularly your recent conference in Burundi?
Well, I've benefited from the experience over the years of seeing what women are doing on the ground in peace building and peacemaking. And of course I saw it in Northern Ireland, in my own country. It was women who came out from the housing estates and met each other and said, we have to stop this killing and kneecapping and destroying the future for our young people. So I was aware of a lot of work being done on preparing women through the Security Council Resolution 1325, that women should be at the table, women should be in decision making, etc. I remember in 2009 going to Kinshasa for a meeting of women from throughout the different provinces of the DRC who were talking about a national plan of action for 1325. And they were so keen to have their voices heard. They were doing so much. And then, through my friend Binta Diop of Femme Africa Solidarity, I've participated in a number of times when regional plans of action were being discussed in the Mano River. And I was aware that there were plans for a regional plan of action in the Great Lakes. So when I got this responsibility, I wanted, as the first woman special envoy appointed by the UN, they made that point to me, I said, well, that means I'm going to do it differently. And I'm not going to just talk with leaders, heads of state, ministers, negotiators. I'm also going to have a bottom-up approach. So I framed what I call the framework of hope and said it's for the benefit of the peoples of the countries. And I'm thinking particularly of women and children who have been the most affected, as I've seen. And we brought together Femme Africa Solidarity, my office, and the International Conference of the Great Lakes, a meeting of about 100 women leaders from the region, mainly from the four countries, the DRC, Rwanda, Burundi and Uganda, in Bujumbura, in the capital of Burundi, on the 9th to the 11th of July. And it was a great opportunity to see the energy, the enthusiasm, but also the anger and frustration, particularly the women from the DRC and from the eastern DRC, the Kivus, North and South Kivu. They were angry at the daily toll, the terrible stories, the awful situation that they've been facing for 19 years now, because it was after the genocidal killing in Rwanda that this happened. And of course, I had participated in 2010 as chair of a civil society advisory group to the UN on women, peace and security, talking about strengthening and implementing that resolution 1325. So for me, it's bringing a lot of things together, and I'm glad I'm in a position where I can give space to women to participate.
So you spoke a little about how you're working with bottom-up, not only with leaders, but when you are working with leaders, what are some of the strategies you've used to get buy-in from these high-level men on issues of gender and for your framework of hope?
The reason that I accepted this difficult task, which came as a complete surprise to me at the end of February, I was appointed on the 18th of March, was because I know the presidents. I was the first head of state to go to Rwanda after the genocidal killing in 1994. Here was a post-genocide country, Rwanda, with a huge exodus of the genocidaires, as they're called, the bad guys, but also families, children, etc., into Goma and then elsewhere in the DRC. And I wanted to bring that to the table. My third visit to Rwanda as President of Ireland in March 1997 was to a Pan-African Women's Conference. Less than 3 years after the genocidal killing, they had the incredible courage and strength to have a conference about the fact that women and widows would have to play more of a role. And of course, this is part of why Rwanda's had such a successful internal development path.
So you have a much longer history than UN, than just your
I'm
role
an
as
elder.
special envoy. And throughout your career, you've never been shy about looking critically at their actions. What is your evaluation of how the UN has been implementing 1325? What do you think are some of the success stories, and where do you still see unrealized gaps?
I was very critical when I was working in African countries for another organisation which I established when I finished my term as High Commissioner. In 2009, we decided to really start a campaign about the 10th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325, which led to this high-level advisory group, which Binta Diop and myself co-chaired. And we were in touch with all the organisations that were working on peace and security in different parts of the world. We were getting a lot of messages. There were very few, I think there was one, maybe two women special representatives of the Secretary General. Mediators were not speaking to women, they were not asking women for their participation, and there was a lot of discontent. So we worked throughout that year of 2010 up to October, and in fact during a meeting of the African Union which took place in Uganda, I went to the home of President Museveni in the country, his farm, with Binta Diop and Thelma Wari, another wonderful woman who's based in Kampala, and we asked President Museveni to have a ministerial meeting of the Security Council on 1325, and he promised, because Uganda had the chair in October, they were on the Security Council at the time, and that was one of the longest meetings. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a very good intervention at that. I think it was the longest meeting of the Security Council ever on 1325. Since then, the Secretary General has appointed a significant number of women special representatives of the Secretary General, and guess what? They're very good. And they go into the most difficult, dangerous countries like South Sudan at the moment and others, and they do very well. So the idea that women were somehow not capable is rubbish. And I had a nice opportunity in Burundi to give space for 1325, because there's a work going on under my mandate at the moment to develop benchmarks to hold the 11 heads of state responsible for the commitments they made under the framework of the 24th of February. I asked the 11 heads of state to nominate somebody very close to them to a technical support committee, which my special advisor chairs. And guess what? Not too surprisingly, they all nominated men. So the technical support committee, under the co-chairmanship of Modibo Toure, my special advisor, and Ambassador Diarra, the special representative of the African Union, is all men. But we took indicative benchmarks from that work, and we asked a workshop in Bujumbura of women's groups to have input, and we had very good input on the need to link with issues of peace and security, women at the table to monitor, support for reconstructing women's bodies, which would never have come through the male filter.
Yeah.
And that has now gone to the Technical Support Committee, and it was I could see that the women were very pleased. They were influencing directly a process that was in train, not hearing afterwards what had happened.
Another question that we actually ask everyone that we speak to in these interviews is, how would you define peace and security? You have so much experience in this field, going all the way back from when you were President of Ireland. How would you, based on those experiences, based on the women you've talked to around the world, how would you define peace and security?
I would say that it's certainly not just absence of violence, we all know that. It's much more, it's an enabling environment. When I ask poor women in a village what human rights means to them, the answer I get is more or less access to water and freedom from violence. Mm-hmm. It's actually access to development and freedom from fear. Freedom from want, freedom from fear. What I like about what's happening now in the Great Lakes is, thanks to a joint visit of the Secretary General and the President of the World Bank, we're talking about peace and development together. And that to me is very much part of a definition. I'm not going to try a word definition, there are plenty of good definitions out there, but my definition is broad, and it includes an enabling environment for potential, it includes equality, it includes participation, it includes voice.
Since we have a little bit more time, I was wondering if you could just give us your evaluation of the Great Lakes conflict and where you think the solutions are going to come from.
Well, I don't consider myself a total expert on the Great Lakes. Indeed, I've been talking to people who know a great deal more than I do, and I've been listening, and especially to people on the ground. The value of the framework of the 24th of February which required a special envoy, and that's my task to make that framework work in a true sense, is that it places the responsibility on the leadership of the region. And I think part of my task is to insist that they take the full ownership and responsibility. I'll do whatever I can as special envoy, but they must commit. They must use peer pressure. And then I want the international community to be in solidarity as never before. I want the partner donors not to be saying, we'll do this little bit here and we'll get great advantage in the DRC and somebody else will do that. I want there to be much more synergy and much more coordination. And I can be quite bullying, I'm an elder, and I'm like Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm not saying that I'm, but in a modest way, she was, somebody who could bully those who thought they could get away with less, and I think that's my job, to hold everybody to account.
Since your background is actually in law, in constitutional law, and going back to both as the first woman president of Ireland, but even as a young woman senator working in a fairly conservative lawmaking body, could you talk about the role of women in these transitional post-conflict states in writing constitutions, in creating rule of law frameworks, in politics and governance moving forward?
I'm glad to say that women are much more involved. There are women lawyers groups in most countries now that are very active and very good, and women are holding office in most cabinets now, including justice ministers. In the DRC there's a good justice minister, and that's so important because actually if we're going to come out of this intolerable situation, I heard in Burundi at that conference women from the Kivus crying and saying, this is just not tolerable. We have fighting again. It's been there. We've had to move again. Women are multiply raped, etc. We have to have a working justice system, and that's one of the commitments of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's difficult to do that. It will take a lot of coordination, and it will take a lot of relentless pressure to get it done, because we cannot have impunity. When we arrived on the joint visit to Goma with the Secretary General and President Jim Kim and senior staff from both the UN and the World Bank, and we drove to the Heal Africa hospital, men, women and children stood in silent rows, thousands of them on that road, and they held up just ordinary pieces of paper saying, no impunity, la paix, peace, and it was a desperate appeal. And what I've been aware of is that women are playing a role as magistrates, they're playing a role, they're probably still underestimated in the role they can play. And I'm very encouraged by the new Special Representative of the Secretary General, Martin Kobler, whom I had a conversation with yesterday. He said to me, and I loved to hear him say it, he said, as far as I'm concerned, zero tolerance of gender-based violence. And I said, we will work well together. That is what is needed.